Hello. So in this series of videos, I'm going to be doing very brief overviews of different historical modes of reading or schools of literary and cultural theory. I'm going to try and cover a lot of them. Most of them will be 20th and 21st century because this is when we really had a proliferation of schools of critical thought. But in these very brief summaries, I'm going to try and give you a sense of the key ideas, key concerns, key innovations, and maybe some major drawbacks of these different schools. You'll also see that some of these schools have similar sets of concerns, and there's a lot of overlap between different approaches to literary and cultural theory, different approaches to how we read. So for this video, we're going to be talking about biblical exegesis. This is one of the earliest modes of critical reading in the Western tradition, going back at least to the medieval period. There's a very long tradition of biblical exegesis in the Jewish tradition. We've spent a massive amount of time poring over the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh and other religious writings to figure out what they mean. There's a big Christian history of biblical exegesis, going back at least to the medieval period, etc. So essentially what exegesis is, the word itself sort of just means bringing forth the hidden meanings from a document, in particular religious documents. So interpreting the Tanakh, interpreting the Bible in order to understand the secrets of it, the actual meaning, the deep knowledge contained within these sacred documents. This is essentially what exegesis means. It takes on different forms for different purposes. So that's worth knowing. There is, again, a Jewish scholarly tradition. There are various Jewish scholarly traditions. There are more sort of orthodox conservative traditions that are very focused on particularly questions about how the laws should be understood, about ethical behavior and things like this, relations between different human beings, etc. There's a more mystical tradition that's focused more on sort of metaphysical issues, maybe, more than questions about complying with the law, etc. There's a lot of different traditions that people have utilized for different ways, but again, the fundamental, and within Christianity, there's different traditions as well. One of which I'll talk about in much more detail, but essentially, again, the idea is that exegesis involves close examination of the text, looking at the specific words, the specific ideas, as well as the structure of the texts, in order to figure out what meanings are contained within. One of the big assumptions of exegesis, and this is one of the things that makes it a mode of critical reading, is that the surface level meaning is not the extent of what we have. That is to say, there is deeper meaning. There is a deeper level of symbolic meaning, or the text encodes additional layers that we are meant to understand through close scrutiny that are not immediately obvious. So this is essentially what exegesis means. Now, it takes on specific forms, and across the board, when we talk about exegesis as such, again, that's its big contribution to the history of critical reading, is this idea that the text contains something deeper, that it's not just a question of you read these Bible stories, stories in the Tanakh, whatever it is, stories in the Torah, whatever it is, and they're immediately obvious on their face. That's not the case. And this is the big innovation of exegesis, in a way. Now, part of the problem is that exegesis is often done from a religious perspective, which means that it has a particular religious agenda. This is one of the weaknesses of biblical exegesis very frequently, because it comes to its scholarship with a particular mindset, a particular set of biases, and a particular objective that it wants to prove. This sometimes creates problems of interpretation. Now, to be fair, all scholarship, all approaches to scholars, and all scholars have their own biases, and they have things that they're more likely to see in particular texts. But when you are looking at a religious text from a religious perspective, and your goal is to prove a particular point, sometimes your read is not as objective as it might be. So I think there's a very, very relevant example of this in Christian exegesis, Christian biblical exegesis, namely that a lot of biblical exegesis, starting from the medieval period and going up still through to today, was focused on arguing that the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, is basically written to preview Jesus's coming. So, for instance, Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt is seen as a model for Jesus leading humanity to salvation. Daniel in the lion's den is seen, and the way that Daniel sort of overcomes certain death, etc., is seen as Christ conquering death through the crucifixion and resurrection. There's a passage in Genesis that I've seen in a number of these sort of exegesis type readings where God says to the serpent, the children of human beings will crush your head. And Christians frequently read that as meaning, oh, God's already promising that Jesus will come and overcome Satan, even though the serpent is not actually Satan necessarily in the Bible, in Genesis. And there's no real reason to read that passage as more than people often kill snakes, which is true. Whether or not that's a good thing, whether you like snakes or not, a lot of people do like snakes, whatever it is. That's not the relevant question here. The relevant question here is that part of the tradition of Christian biblical exegesis tends to involve taking a passage like this and saying, clearly this is about Jesus. The writers of the Tanakh or the Torah or whatever it is didn't know that it was about Jesus because they wrote centuries before Jesus showed up, but clearly this was about Jesus. There's a couple of big problems with this. One is, again, it assumes that the end point, I want to prove that the Hebrew Bible promotes Jesus or envisions Jesus. It assumes that that is a legitimate reading and then works backwards from that rather than saying, all right, if we actually look at the Tanakh on its face and in itself for what it does, can we say that it actually envisions Jesus? And realistically, the answer is probably no. Like, you can't really work from what's in the Hebrew Bible to say they envision Jesus, because what the Hebrew Bible talks about is something completely different. Even the idea of the Messiah in Judaism is completely different than what it becomes for Christians. Like, Christians fundamentally redefine what it means to be Messiah for their own purposes. And I'm not critiquing that necessarily. Christian theology is a different religious tradition than Jewish theology. They have differences, whatever it is. But when, from the perspective of Christian biblical exegesis, you look back at the Hebrew Bible and say, they're talking about Messiah, that must mean Jesus. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what that text is meant to do, because the Jewish idea of Messiah is completely different than what it becomes under Christianity. And so the problem that you run into, or the problem you often run into with exegesis, biblical exegesis especially, but exegesis of any religious text, is that because you have a religious agenda, you risk erasing other traditions that would help you actually understand what a particular text is meant to do. The story of Moses leading the Israelites on Exodus out of Egypt, for instance, is really not in the Jewish tradition about Messiah, and it's not about Jesus. Like, if you just read that story on its own, there's no realistic way that you can come to the interpretation that this is imagining a future Savior who will die and be resurrected to relieve all of mankind's sins, unless that's already the idea you have in your mind. So this is a huge limitation of biblical exegesis in general, but especially this particular strand of Christian biblical exegesis, because it assumes that Jesus is the teleological endpoint, that Jesus is what the Bible was always building up toward. You erase the Jewish traditions with its own legitimate theology and its own legitimate purposes for the way that stories are told in the Tanakh, completely gets erased in order to serve the purposes of the exegete, which I think is the term for someone who does exegesis. I may be slightly wrong about that. But like, that's a huge problem in terms of critical reading and critical understanding of a text. If you have to erase the cultural origins and in this case the theological origins, the religious origins of a text, in order to superimpose your own narrative, that raises major questions about how reliable your interpretation is. So again, the great thing about exegesis is it recognizes that texts are not surface level things, that they are not self-evident, and that they require critical reading, study, and interpretation. And that's huge. We couldn't have the discipline that I am in, English literature studies. We could not have literary studies without that fundamental recognition. But again, you risk having to erase other traditions that might even give you better explanations of what a text is meant to do when you come to it with a particular agenda that you need to superimpose.